Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The sound of hooves on dry earth came just as she flattened herself behind the barn, dress catching on splinters, breath locked in her throat. Francesca Rowen did not know whose horse it was, only that if it belonged to her husband, she would not survive the night. The wind kicked up dust across the parched grassland, and the sun slipped behind the hills like it was ashamed of what it had seen. Her hands trembled as she held the hem of her skirt close, knees digging into the dirt. Behind her, inside the barn, her two children Daisy, 6, and Daniel, 4, waited, hidden beneath hay and sackcloth. She had not planned it this way. She had meant only to take the children and run when he rode out to town. But he had returned early, drunk and angry, and she had no choice but to bolt. Just after sunset, she had fled with only what she could carry, the children, a tin of biscuits, and the bruises blooming down her ribs. The rider halted on the other side of the barn. She heard the soft thud of boots hitting earth, a creak of saddle leather, then silence. Francesca pressed her back to the wall, fingers curled into fists. "Madam?" The voice was deep, low, and kind. Not slurred, not impatient. It carried a careful edge like he did not want to startle her. She did not answer. "I saw the smoke." The voice came again, closer now. "Barn looks half burnt out. You all right?" Francesca shut her eyes. The barn had caught earlier that week. Her husband had blamed her, thrown a lantern after her when she had tried to put it out, the fire licking along the walls before the rain stamped it out. The blackened beams still stank of ash. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said. "Name's Xander Flint. Just passing through." She peeked around the corner. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and a rifle slung loose across his back. His horse stood tethered to a fence post, calm and quiet. He wore no badge, no uniform. Just trail-worn clothes and a face lined with dust and travel. Francesca stepped out from behind the barn. She did not speak. He looked at her like he saw everything: her torn sleeve, the dried blood on her lip, the way she clutched her side. He did not stare. He did not pity. He just watched her, steady. "Did he do that to you?" She hesitated, then nodded. He did not ask who. "Your children?" he asked gently. "In the barn." Her voice cracked. "Hiding." He took a small step closer, slow and respectful. "May I see him?" She nodded again. Francesca turned and opened the barn door just wide enough. "Daisy, Daniel. It's all right now. Come out." Two small figures emerged from the hay. Daisy ran straight to her mother, arms tight around her waist. Daniel held back, peering warily at the stranger. Xander crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "Hey there, son. You keeping your mama and sister safe?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That's a fine job you're doing." Francesca looked up at the sky, pale with stars. "We cannot stay here." "No, ma'am," Xander said. "You cannot." He looked at her, not just at her bruises, but her really looked. And then he reached out his hand. She stared at it. "I do not know you," she whispered. "No, ma'am," he said again. "But I know trouble when I see it. You want your kids safe, you take my hand. I will get you out of here." She looked down at Daisy, then to Daniel. Then she reached out. Her fingers met his. He closed his hand around hers. Firm, warm, and just like that, she did not feel alone anymore. He led them to his horse, lifted Daisy gently into the saddle, then Daniel. Francesca climbed up behind him, and he adjusted his hat low over his brow. "Where are we going?" she asked. "As far from here as you need," he said. "There's a widow in Red Bluff lets travelers stay. We will rest there tonight. After that, we will figure it out." She leaned into his back, arms around the children. It was not just the road they were riding toward. It was something else. She felt it in the way his hand had closed around hers. Strong. Sure. For the first time in years, she let herself hope. And as the moon rose behind them, Francesca Rowen rode away from the life that had broken her toward the man who had offered more than just escape. He had offered his hand. And maybe his heart. The lantern light in the widow's parlor flickered low, casting soft shadows on the worn pine floorboards. The house sat half a mile east of Red Bluff, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods and sheltered against the worst of the wind. It smelled faintly of dried apples and hearth ash, and for the first time in days, Francesca sat without flinching at every creak of wood. The widow, a gray-haired woman named Alma Torrens, had taken one look at the bruises on Francesca's jaw and said simply, "You're staying as long as you need." Then she'd handed Francesca a basin of warm water and ushered the children toward the back room. Now, with Daisy and Daniel asleep on quilts beside Alma's granddaughter, Francesca sat on a stool near the fireplace, her hands curled around a chipped teacup. The tea was bitter and strong, but it grounded her. Xander stood near the window, arms folded loosely, watching the yard. His hat sat on the table beside her, and a thin line of sweat still marked his collar from the ride. "I didn't expect you to speak for me," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I didn't," he replied without turning. "I just opened a door. You stepped through it." She looked down at the steam curling from her cup. "You don't know what he's capable of." "No," he said, "but I've seen men like him. And I've seen what's left behind when no one steps in." He turned then, crossed the room, and settled into the chair opposite her. The firelight caught the scar just above his left brow, a thin, pale mark that looked long-healed. She studied it. "That from a fight? South of Fort Laramie," he said. "Stagecoach ambush. Wasn't my fight until it was." Francesca set her cup down. "You carry yourself like someone who's always watching." "I am. That a habit or a burden?" He met her eyes. "Depends on the day." The wind pressed faintly against the shutters, rattling them just enough to draw her gaze. She realized her shoulders had eased. The ache in her side had dulled. "You've done this before?" she asked. "Helped women leave?" "No," he said. "Not like this. Not with children. Not with someone who looked me in the eye and didn't flinch." She blinked. "I flinched plenty. Not when I offered my hand." The room held a long quiet after that. Not tense. Just full. She rose, took the empty cups to a sideboard, and rinsed them in the basin. He didn't follow her with his eyes, didn't press her with more words. That alone made something inside her soften. "You have people?" she asked, her back to him. "Brother in Kansas," he said. "Has a farm. We don't write much." She dried the cups with a linen cloth. "Why not? Too many years passed between us. Hard to catch up when everything's changed." She set the cups back on the shelf. "I had a sister once, in Missouri. Lost her to the fever." He didn't offer sympathy, just nodded, accepting it like a stone placed gently in his hand. She turned to him again. "You planning to ride on?" "Haven't decided. I'd understand if you did." He stood slowly, stepped close enough she could see the trail dust still clinging to his boots. "I don't ride off without reason," he said. "And I haven't found one yet." She looked up into his face. The scar, the dust, the quiet in his eyes. And something steadied in her chest. "I'll help Alma in the kitchen tomorrow," she said. "It's the least I can do. I'll chop wood." She nodded. They stood a breath longer, the fire crackling low between them, and then he stepped back, gave her a quiet goodnight, and disappeared down the hall to the lean-to where he'd bed down. Francesca sat back on the stool and stared into the hearth. She didn't know what tomorrow would ask of her. But tonight, the world held still long enough for her to begin imagining one. The morning broke pale and cold, surprising for August, with a low mist clinging to the earth like memory. Francesca stepped outdoors with her sleeves rolled and a basket in her arms, drawn by the quiet promise of work. Alma had pointed her toward the henhouse and the pump earlier, and now she moved between them, gathering eggs with careful hands and rinsing her apron in the cold water. From the edge of the field, the sound of chopping rang out steady, deliberate. Xander stood near the woodpile, shirt sleeves pushed up, handling the axe with practiced rhythm. She hadn't seen him yet, and she didn't call out. She only watched for a moment, then turned back to her task. By the time the sun had risen full, she found herself in the kitchen with Alma, kneading dough for biscuits while the older woman sliced rhubarb for a tart. "You're quick with your hands," Alma said without looking up. "I used to do this every morning," Francesca answered. "Before things changed." Alma's knife paused, but she didn't speak. She let the silence stand as it was. After breakfast, they brought dishes out to the porch. Daniel and Daisy sat cross-legged near the steps, trading pebbles like currency. Francesca moved to gather the laundry basket but paused when Xander stepped up from the path. "There's a man in town running freight up to Cody," he said. "He's looking for someone to help manage his account books. Says he's got more numbers than sense." Francesca handed him a folded shirt. "You think I'm looking for arithmetic? I think you're looking for something that's yours. This might be a start." She didn't answer right away. She folded a worn pair of Alma's stockings, then said, "I was a schoolmistress once. Before I married. I remember enough to keep a man honest with his figures." Xander leaned against the porch rail. "Then maybe it's time someone saw that." Francesca met his eyes, not with surprise, but a quiet sort of curiosity. "You mean for us to stay here?" "I mean for you to choose," he said. "I'll ride with you if you want to go. But if this place feels safe, I figure there's no need to outrun peace." Later, when the sun had begun its slow descent and the house smelled of warm fruit and lye soap, she found him near the corral, checking the gelding's hooves. She stood beside the fence, arms crossed loosely, watching him work. "Why did you stop here?" she asked. His hand moved slow over the fetlock. "Horse needed rest. I saw the smoke and something told me not to ride on." "That something ever steered you wrong?" "Plenty," he said. "But not that day." She let that settle between them, the weight of it not heavy, just real. Daniel's voice rang out from the porch. "Mama, Daisy found a frog." Francesca smiled, the kind that didn't reach her mouth but lived somewhere deeper, and turned to go. Before she reached the steps, Xander called after her. "I'll stay a while if you'll have me." She didn't turn around, just said, "You already are." Then she stepped inside, the screen door easing closed behind her. That night, as she tucked the children into their quilts, Francesca felt the unfamiliar fullness of a day lived without bracing for anger. She pressed a kiss to each forehead and dimmed the lamp. In the front room, Xander sat with his boots off, reading an old newspaper Alma had saved. She crossed the room and sat beside him without asking. He offered her the page. "Half the stories are lies." "I don't mind," she said. "It's the quiet I came for." He folded the paper and laid it aside. "You trust it now?" "The quiet." She hesitated, then nodded. "A little more than yesterday." Xander didn't speak again. He just reached over, slow and sure, and set his hand palm up between them. This time she didn't hesitate. She laced her fingers with his. And they sat that way, two people who had seen too much, leaning into the hush of earned stillness. By the third week at the edge of Red Bluff, the rhythms of the house had settled into something close to ordinary. Francesca rose before first light, helped Alma with the morning leavening, and saw Daisy and Daniel off to the makeshift school tent the church had pitched behind the general store. The children had taken to the place as if it had always belonged to them. Xander had started helping the freight hauler in town, mostly with loading and repairs, but he still returned by dusk, always brushing his boots at the door before stepping inside. Quiet as ever, but his presence filled the corners of the room in ways she noticed more each day. That evening, after supper had been cleared and Alma retired early with a jar of liniment for her knees, Francesca sat on the back stoop peeling apples by lantern light. A breeze swept through the cottonwoods, cool and scented faintly with sage and distant rain. Xander came around from the shed where he'd been oiling saddle leather. He didn't ask if he could sit, he just did, easing down beside her with a soft grunt. She didn't look up. "You always work after sundown?" "Only when my hands feel restless," he said. I peel apples when I don't want to think." He glanced at the growing pile of skins at her feet. "You thinking less yet?" "Maybe," she said. "Or just different." They were quiet for a time, the knife rasping through flesh, the lantern throwing their shadows long across the porch boards. Then he said, "I saw your boy watching me this morning. Before school." Francesca set another apple in the bowl. "He's trying to decide if you're staying." "Are you?" "I asked you first." Xander let the question sit. "I never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Never thought there was much point. And now?" He reached down, picked up a curl of apple skin, and twisted it between his fingers. "Now I think the point might be people, not places." Francesca turned the next apple in her hand. "I used to think if I just kept moving inside my own mind, nothing could catch me. But standing still's harder. You don't seem afraid of hard." "I'm not," she said. I just don't want to choose wrong again. Xander leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not him. She didn't flinch. I know. I'd never raise a hand to a woman. I don't speak to children like they're beneath me. I fix what I break, and I don't walk away from what I help build. She looked at him then. Why are you telling me this now? Because you look at me like you're weighing something every time I walk through that door. I want you to know what you're holding in your hands. The knife stilled against the fruit. She set both aside and wiped her palms on her apron. I'm not ready to make promises, she said. I'm not asking for one, he said. I just want to be something you can lean on. Francesca stood, brushed the flour dust from her skirt, and stepped down onto the grass. She turned back toward him, the lantern glow soft on her face. I'll walk with you to the church tomorrow, she said. They're setting up bookshelves in the school tent. They could use another pair of hands. He stood, slow and steady. I'll meet you at the gate. She nodded once. Then, as she passed him to go inside, she paused just long enough that he felt the warmth of her shoulder near his. It wasn't a promise, but it was a step. And in that house that held no ghosts, beneath a roof that had never heard her cry, Francesca finally slept with both hands open. The sun had climbed high by the time Francesca stepped into the churchyard, her palms dry with dust and wood grain. The school tent stood open like a linen sail, and inside, the two youngest sons of the pastor were handing up boards for new shelving. Xander was already there, sleeves rolled, hammer in hand, measuring a plank against the wall. He glanced over when she arrived but didn't stop working. She joined without a word, sliding a crate of dried ink pots out of the way and kneeling to sort through the stack of worn readers and arithmetic primers. When he passed her a length of cedar, she took it, fingers brushing his. You were late, he said, eyes on his work. She wiped her palms on her skirt. Daisy had a loose stitch in her hem. She wouldn't stand for it. He nodded once, then returned to the shelf. They worked like that for a while, quiet but not distant, the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. It was only when the last nail was set and the sun had begun to shift toward the west that she spoke again. I asked Alma if she needed extra hands come autumn, she said, straightening a row of spellers. You thinking of staying through the cold? She looked up. I'm thinking of staying through everything. Xander leaned his weight back against the edge of the table, arms crossed. That means something different than it did a month ago. I know. She rose, dusting off her apron. Most of my life, I made choices out of fear. Staying quiet, staying put, staying married when the marriage was already a wound. I won't do that again. What will you do? I'll choose what's good for me. For Daisy. For Daniel. She met his gaze. For us. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he stepped close, and his voice dropped into something quieter than the room itself. Say it again. She didn't blink. Us. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. No hesitation left. No weight between them. His palm was rough, warm, familiar now. You sure? I've never been more. They left the churchyard when the last of the children had scattered and the tent flaps had been tied down for the night. Daniel was already home, chasing Alma's cat around the side of the house. Daisy had taken up a needle and was bent over a patch of calico, her tongue caught in concentration. Later, when the children were settled and the fire in the hearth burned low, Francesca stood by the window, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. Xander came up behind her, his steps soft, but she knew they were his. She turned toward him, not needing words. Will you marry me? He asked, no flourish, no bowing pretense. She didn't hesitate. Yes. He exhaled, something unwinding in his shoulders. I haven't got land to offer. I don't need land, she said. I need a man who walks beside me. And you've done that from the moment you offered your hand. They were married on a clear day in early October, outside the same church where they'd built shelves and stitched together a quiet future. Alma sewed Francesca's dress from muslin she'd kept for years, and the pastor's wife laid out preserves and bread on a cloth-covered table. Daisy wore a ribbon in her hair, and Daniel carried a bundle of wildflowers that kept losing petals in the wind. Xander didn't wear anything new, only his cleanest shirt and a look that hadn't left his face since Francesca placed her hand in his. After the blessing, he didn't kiss her in front of the crowd. He only leaned in close and said, "Thank you for choosing me." That night, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, Francesca sat on the edge of their bed, brushing out her hair. Xander stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching her like he still couldn't believe she was real. She looked over her shoulder. "You coming in, husband?" He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her, taking up the brush. "Let me." She let the brush fall into his hands, and he ran it through her hair slow and careful. Every stroke a word he didn't need to say. When he set it down, she turned and pulled him in close. "I don't need perfect," she whispered against his collar. "I just need this. You. Here. I won't ever leave. You don't have to say it. I want to." They lay down together, not with urgency, but with the kind of closeness that grows from days spent choosing one another again and again. And they kept choosing. Through the first snow and the second spring. Through the lean months and the quiet joys. Daisy grew taller, Daniel steadier, and Xander built them a warm room off the back of the house where Francesca kept her sewing and her books. She took up teaching again, just part days, when the church school needed her. And every evening, Xander returned home before the sun slipped past the hills, always brushing his boots at the door, always reaching for her hand before he said a word. There were no grand declarations, just the rhythm of shared work, shared quiet, and the deep, steady comfort of having survived the worst and found love on the other side. And that was enough. More than enough. They stayed. They healed. They loved. And it was good.